Well, welcome to Module 3, Week 3 of our final PEP series. So, what did we look at last week? Last week, we examined about the cycle of teaching and the initial data collection that we might do and collate that information and towards the purpose that how would we then teach. We went through a bit of a summary of that and some aspects of the domains of differentiation, looking at interest, looking at readiness, and also their learner profile. Well, this week we're going to do a little bit more on that assessment. It's going to be some review of and pulling forward some of the things you've already done in terms of assessment, but then contextualize it in this teaching cycle that we've done. So let's go forward in the fly through. So that was an activity I do in class. But before I start it, for interest, I'll get you to have a look at this article about teachers, because we want you to be a great Christian educator. So it's an interesting article, and I don't know if I can quickly get it up for you. Now, some of the things we looked at in week number 1, but it has a different angle on it. A sense of mission. Strive for excellence, not perfection. That's a key difference. Love your students. Teach from your heart. Be humble, be real, be authentic, I would add. Encouragement, be a positive classroom environment, and develop your relationship with God, because out of that relationship that you become that Christian educator. So that's a real key one. Seek wisdom, truth, think biblically, think in seeking through prayer about your class, labouring for it, your class. Trust God, don't be afraid, go for it, and go with the leaning of God perhaps too. And the fruit of the Spirit, and if you go through all of them, particularly that joy, you must have, I think, a positive, joyful classroom. So there's a little snapshot of some of the things it was talking about that you might want to have a little bit more of a look at. So here's our cycle again. The collecting phase, we're certainly looking at data, and then there's a responding, and it's a dynamic cycle that goes through. So that's where we're heading today. So we're going to look at assessment. This is a bit of a review. Assessment for learning, as learning, and of learning. Now, you've heard those terms before. Assessment for means you use information, and it helps you for the learning. Assessment as learning, in the sense it might be a project, exercise, and you learn by doing the assessment task. And assessment of learning is more traditional, where you do a unit of work and you record what a student has achieved. Now, all of those are quite valid, but I suppose if you ask yourself the question, which is the most predominant sort of assessment that you have experienced or have seen in classrooms on your PEP? I think in the surveys, it's off. It's just enter the unit, get the result, get it in a report card. But I think for and as provide opportunity, and the GTPA is structured, and I think a good teaching practice is looking at the of learning, for learning and as learning. Now, some of them might be a project-based as, but let's have a look at for. That's that formative assessment along the way. And good teachers are doing that observationally. That's a form of assessing, but it's also more formalized and structured. You're intentionally collecting samples of work and assessing where they are, little quizzes or feedback and so on, or student input. So here's a video I'd like you to have a look at that answers look at those. The assessment for learning. What does it mean? What's it mean? What's the examples? What's its benefit? How is it different to of learning, perhaps exams? So go through that task. So here's a summary of it. So it is diagnostic as a pretest, and it's along the way. Now, you can categorize assessment by many different forms, and this is just one of them. But you'll be doing in your PEP a pre-assessment, and it will be diagnostic to help you understand the student. But also you'll be doing along the way, collecting information about your students. So that will inform the next lesson or the next week of learning that you'll do. of learning is the summative type, which I think we're quite familiar with. Now, this link is, remember that big, I call it the DEB prac, with the unit outline that you did. And in that unit outline, you had to specify the formative assessment along the way. So we're looking at how do you incorporate assessment along the way to help you inform your teaching. So you might have started off, you made some initial data collection, you think this is the way to go, but it's a cycle. And you'll do some data collects and say, oh, yes, they get it, they don't get it. Do I need to fill a pothole of learning, so to speak? Oh, can I extend them here? So that formative assessment becomes part of a structure in your unit plan. Another video to have a look at those two things there. You'll find it beneficial. Take some notes, take some insights from there. As learning, and that's the project-based. It emphasises the student and the learner is gaining learning as they are doing. And look, if there's opportunities in your practice, maybe not on your PEP, but as you become a teacher, don't forget to look at those opportunities, and the students will do the work themselves. It releases you as a teacher. It's not all from you. You can actually be roaming, facilitating, guiding, and being that mentor type things. Here's if you want to do that as a task, to have a look at a mind map. And here's an example of how you could categorize assessment a whole different ways, and that's one student's work. So that's an exercise. So data collection. In the collecting phase, you'll do a pre-assessment, you'll do ongoing assessment for learning, and you'll do summative assessment as part of your teaching cycle, a unit of work, and it's certainly exactly what you'll be doing in GTPA. You'll be doing all those things. We've looked at, have looked at all those things there, in the first 3 modules that we've considered. And assessment for readiness, assessing and gathering data for the interest and passion, and gathering data for the learning profile, helps you then select the content, the level of content, the type of content, the format of the content, the strategies you'll use to engage in your class, what sort of outcomes or product do you want students to produce in a lesson and across the unit of work, and in some ways will guide your learning environment that you have. So let's go through about some of that assessment again. Now, we looked at some of these things last week. Your pre-assessment, that's your initial data collect that you have. And here's some things that are on the Moodle page that you might wish to consider about how do you record professional discussions and so on. This is your pre-assessment that you go through that I emphasise. It's the first step in assessing for learning. It's diagnostic, and that will guide your initial one. Here is from your text, and it talks about how you can use all these different vehicles, all these tools to get assessment along the way, or a pre-assessment. Now, the check for understanding are more along the way, and there's different levels of things. So have a look at that chart, pause the video and say, I could actually, KWA, LTAR, what's that about? Could I use that? Yes, I use conferences and quizzes along the way. I'll use homework as a check for understanding and so on. An exit card to check for understanding. So here's some examples that we're flicking through that you might wish to have a look at. I think they're hyperlinked, so you can have a look at those resources, but there's a multitude of things that you could do for assessment at the beginning, for diagnostic, and along the way. Well, if you visit a class, you would have got a boarding pass that talks about that. And the boarding pass is a great way of checking understanding of the students as they come in. And it's also good for a little revision of what happened last week, for example. But here's some other areas that you could use over here for pre-assessment purposes. Watch this video that talks about the role of assessment that you have here. Again, a Freya model we throw out to class to say, what does assessment look like? How could you categorise it? What it is, what it isn't. This is an activity, a separate activity that I've done in class. So here again is some pulling forward some data sources, and we'll have a look at some of those things. Quick data sources, I said mid-level data sources that you can do. 3, 2, 1. 3 I learned, things I found out, so 1 question I have, for example, and I actually use that in class in reference to your GTPA. Exit cards, entry cards. These are some things a little bit different. Some of those, for example, poll everywhere, for example, might really get the students engaged in their learning. We're familiar with Kahoots, aren't we? But there's actually a different level of Kahoot that you can do, and you actually can use Kahoot to actually not just have a fun review of your learning activity, but actually can give you some feedback on what students have gained and not gained, and we'll go through that and have a look at some of the data you can collect. Although it's it's one of those along the way. It's not actually a summative task. It's not that useful. Quizlet is another little web-based that you can have tests and so on and activities, and you can collect data from that references to your students, but also is great for lesson review. So we do a little Kahoot to finish off in class, and then we open up the Kahoot and we see what is available in terms of the Kahoot information. So when you do a Kahoot, have a look at it, see if you go to a section, download the data, and the data will tell you what questions people got right, what questions they got wrong, percent overall in the class, and so on. And you can use that as a simple little tool along the way. And this is the report. So I downloaded the report, it's on the screen, and I can look at the final scores here. I can summarize that. So this question here, it's all green. It's lovely. It gives you a color code. So if I scroll across, I say, oh, they've got this, they've got this, they've got this. Ooh, they haven't got that. That's all the red, the wrongs. So what choice, that might be an area that you need to reteach or go over or review or express differently and so on. So that's a quick little squiz, and you can have a look at individual answers, who got right. You can see what each student got along that. So this is a simple little tool. It does it automatically. Gee, that's a nice little bit of data you can then use to go forward. Problem with Kahoot perhaps is it's all about speed. Well, if you can actually set it up so it's not about speed, you actually can use it for understanding. And things like, as I showed, Quizlet and other things allow you also to gather information electronically easily for that. So use it in its right context and place. Don't overemphasize if it's only a very small item, but it is useful. So this, to conclude, this is all about using formative assessment or assessment for learning, and understanding that you must do pre-assessment, assessment for learning, and summative assessment along the way. And we've expanded upon what those 4 learning tools could be. And don't discount that what I haven't talked about is as much is student work samples. They are really formative in terms of your understanding along the way. So in your GTPA and in your PEP, you'll need to be collecting data sets along the way every week. So that helps you to inform your work. Section number 3 of the GTPA expressly asks you to list your assessment types. List and describe your feedback types that you give, and then talk about your summative assessment task as well. So it covers that area. This is acutely aligned to your GTPA section number 3.